2 a.m., July 17, 1918. Several shots were fired at a man and his family. The murderers rejoiced and were thrilled about the crime they just committed. These murderers, later identified as communist soldiers, sought Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and the imperial family in the basement of their exiled home about 1,100 miles outside of Moscow, the capital of Russia. These soldiers literally ended the Czarist state of Russia and began the new Soviet communist order. This new power structure ended the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled over Russia for more than 300 years. But why did the soldiers shoot at the Tsar and the royal imperial family? Could the murderous rampage been prevented? And was it necessary for the men to kill the ruler? As noted above, the Romanov family ruled over Russia for the last 300 or so years, and their family ruled over one of the world's largest empires, stretching over 3 continents and encompassing almost 9 million square miles and roughly 182 million people. Russia wasn't always ruled by this imperial family. The Russian Empire first started off as a small collection of cities that grew into the Kievan Rus and Kievan Rus Empire that lasted until the Mongolian invasion of Russia in the 13th century under Genghis Khan's grandson Batu Khan. The Mongols ruled over Russia from the 13th century into the early 1500s, when Ivan IV's father ended the Golden Yoke. His grandson, Ivan the Terrible, ruled over this newly conquered land as the Romanovs continued Ivan's rule. The Romanovs came into power during the early 17th century, and Michael Romanov was Ivan the Terrible's father-in-law. The Romanov dynasty would include some of the world's greatest rulers, from Peter the Great to Catherine the Great, Alexander II, his son Alexander III, and his son, the last Tsar of the Romanov Russian dynasty, Tsar Nicholas II. This particular Russian family would rule for more than 300 years until the communists took over after Russia's devastating defeat in the Great War, later known as World War I. Again, Russia was a country that was founded upon tyranny that constantly squashed cultural differences for the betterment of society. Russians do not like cultural differences. They prefer just the true Russian culture. Yet, the one cultural aspect that kept Russia together was the Orthodox Christian faith. Each Tsar made sure the church was a main component of their reign. The church was also a place where the subjects, the people, could vent their hatred of the rulers secretly. However, the church and state became one later on in Russian history. One ruler who ruled Russia with an iron fist was Tsar Nicholas II with the help of the church. But before I mention this Tsar, I must first talk about how he came to power. The Romanovs' most important ruler was Peter the Great, who ruled over Russia during the 17th century, and he was the grandson of Michael Romanov, the founding member of this household. Peter the Great's granddaughter, Catherine the Great, too changed Russia for the better, and her successful changes were continued under her grandson, Tsar Alexander I, who would rule Russia from 1801 to 1825. The Russian people demanded change under Alexander I, since they had no rights or privileges since the Romanovs came to power in 1613. Tsar Alexander I wanted to create a cabinet with a checks of systems and balances. However, he promised it, but it never came about, because of what was literally on his doorstep. During the time of Alexander I's rule, Napoleon Bonaparte came to power in revolutionary France after the Revolution of 1789 in Paris. Napoleon wanted to recreate the French Empire, and he wanted to come into Russia and take over certain parts. Well, Napoleon Bonaparte's ideas of taking over Russia ended at the Battle of Waterloo during one of the hardest and coldest winters in Russian history. And Napoleon also lost because of Russia. During this time, the Tsar wanted to give his people rights and privileges, but at the same time he took them away so he could have his troops focus on Napoleon's eastward advancement into his territory. Tsar Alexander I needed to defend his power and, most importantly, his Russian homeland. He recruited his men and military to protect Russia from the evils of the French. During this warfare, the Napoleonic Wars, the Tsar had a vision that if he defeated Bonaparte, he would change Russia for the better. His promises never came, though. After Napoleon lost power in 1815, Tsar Alexander I turned his country to more important changes, and his people never got the most basic human rights and privileges. Alexander I died in 1825 while on vacation, and his brother Nicholas became the new Tsar, Tsar Nicholas I, who would rule Russia from 1825 to 1855. Tsar Nicholas I was a grandson of Catherine the Great and an ancestor of both Peter the Great and Michael Romanov. Tsar Nicholas I's reign was anything but easy. One example of what happened during his reign was Nicholas's relationship with a group of nobles called the Union of Welfare. This group of nobles wanted a constitution, and they wanted the Tsar to become a constitutional monarch. Tsar Nicholas I argued that Russia needed to preserve the autocracy of Russia to keep the balance of power intact, and that Russia was not ready yet for a constitution or governmental change. This wave of change led to a rebellion in 1825 called the Decembrist Rebellion that also occurred during Nicholas's coronation, where 300 people died, and Nicholas somehow preserved the Romanov Dynastic Rule and started creating a newly democratic Russian state. Tsar Nicholas I's reign ended in 1855, and following him was his son, Tsar Alexander II. Tsar Alexander II was nicknamed the Liberator because, in 1861, he emancipated the serfs or Russian enslaved laborers. Tsar Alexander II had this to say about his emancipation in 1861. The peasants now bound to the soil shall, within the term fixed by the law, be vested with the full rights of freemen. In other words, Tsar Alexander II freed the equivalent of Russian slaves, just like Abraham Lincoln would do a few years later during our American Civil War. Tsar Alexander II went on to do many great things for Russia, including proposing giving Russia a constitution and making himself a constitutional monarch. But unfortunately, his hopes never came to fruition. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II and his son, the future Tsar Alexander III, were on their way from the home in St. Petersburg called the Hermitage to the military barracks a few miles down the road. On the way to the military inspection, a few men were crowding around the movement line, and one person threw a bomb at the host carrying the Russian family. The host was initially hurt, but the Tsar, instead of going into hiding with his Secret Service, went on to inspect the military at the military barracks in St. Petersburg. However, that wasn't a smart thing to do, because a few moments later, Tsar Alexander II lost his life. someone threw a bomb in his way, and it was detonated, and he literally was assassinated. Where he was assassinated was in front of a holy Russian Orthodox church, which will later be renamed the Church of Our Savior of the Spilled Blood, meaning they renamed the church in honor of Tsar Alexander II and his reign. You can still see it today in St. Petersburg, downtown, by the canals. And when you think about it, Tsar Alexander II was the complete opposite of his father and his uncle. Tsar Alexander II was very liberal and was well loved by his subjects because he basically gave his subjects the right of freedom in 1861. However, as I just mentioned, a lot of people didn't like Alexander II, and that's why they assassinated him in 1881. And now, following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, his son, Alexander III, is crowned, and this new Tsar, as many Romanov rulers felt, did not trust Russian people because they literally just killed his father during a military inspection walk. The newly crowned Tsar, Alexander III, renounced his father's liberal ways and policies in the name of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Tsar Alexander III believed that only the Orthodox Church, with the help of the autocrat, could rule over Russia, and Russia would be ruled under one nationality, the Russian people, one language, Russia or Slavic, Cyrillic Russia, Russian, and one religion, Orthodox. However, Alexander III had high hopes for his country, but he only ruled from 1881 until 1894, when he died at the age of 49 in southwest Greece when he was visiting his family. His son, Nicholas, would become Tsar Nicholas II, the last Russian Tsar to rule. Tsar Nicholas II had no real intentions to rule when his father died in 1894, and he wasn't brought up to be a Tsar. He thought his younger brother Michael would be the heir. However, Alexander III chose Nicholas, since he was the oldest son, to become his successor, if anything so happened to him. The world mourned the death of Nicholas II's father very hard. Even though Tsar Alexander III was seen as a tyrant, many rulers in the world valued him, and they didn't see Tsar Nicholas II as heir or as a successor for Russia. Tsar Alexander II's son, Nicholas, was once seen as Germany as weak and delicate, but Germany later renounced their claims and called the new Tsar mentally strong and physically fit. At the same time, when the world was mourning Alexander III's death in 1894, President Grover Cleveland of the United States personally wrote to Tsar Nicholas II his sincerest apologies for the loss of his father and wished him good luck on his reign. This is really interesting to note that, one, a United States president wrote to a Russian Tsar, and two, they had differences of opinions. Grover Cleveland wrote a heartfelt, sincere letter to show his true and utmost respect for the loss of the Russian ruler. So that was really interesting when I was writing this, and I found that out. But going back to my paper. At the same time, Nicholas II, again, he didn't know what to do as a ruler. He wasn't brought up as being a ruler, and he literally said this when he got news of his father's untimely death. "What is going to happen to me and all of Russia? I am not prepared to be a Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling." Again, Tsar Nicholas II did grow up in a strict military household under Alexander III, and his father did teach him keen administration skills that he would later possess as a Tsar, but he really didn't know how to rule because he wasn't really trained. Moreover, Tsar Nicholas II ruled Russia from his father's death in 1894 until 1917, when he was forced to abdicate his throne during the onset of an internal civil war and during the midst of World War I. The Tsar was crowned in 1896, almost a year and a half after his father's death. His coronation was held with high regard, and the word Tsar's new bride, Tsar Alexandria, for the first time. Tsar Alexandria was the daughter of the Greek monarch and the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. This is interesting to note too, because Queen Victoria of England was seen as a matchmaker. A majority of her grandchildren was seen as being married off to different heads of state in Europe. So that way, when World War I came on, literally there was family going to war, with Russia going against his German cousin Kaiser Wilhelm II, going against England, their cousin. So it was interesting to see that. During the coronation in 1896, Tsar Nicholas II was sprayed with holy water and was referred to as King of Kings and Ruler of Rulers. This is interesting to note because the Russian state is portraying Nicholas II to be the utmost power in Europe, since he's the King of Kings and the Ruler of Rulers. Also during this coronation, the high priest presented the newly crowned ruler with the royal purple imperial cloth. During the coronation of Tsar Nicholas II, the high priest presented the newly crowned ruler with the royal purple imperial Romanov cloth. The cloth was a symbol of Tsar Nicholas II's reign. He would cover and rule the Russian people, and he would protect these people as a robe covered and protected him. In other words, Nicholas would rule over his people as a Christian, going back to the ideals of nationality, orthodoxy, and autocracy under Tsar Alexander III, his father. And he was to protect the people from harm's way. And interestingly enough, on top of this, the high priest mentioned that Nicholas was a divine right representative, which is odd because during this time a lot of the other monarchs in Europe were not seen as divine right. They were seen as just monarchs and not as a God's representative on earth. Furthermore, Tsar Nicholas II's reign was full of bloodshed, that he was nicknamed Bloody Nicholas the Bloody by historians. For example, one event that showed just how bloody his reign was around the turn of the century. Russia entered into a war with the Japanese over Korea and over a sphere of influence. Russia soon lost the war, and the world was shocked that a mighty European empire lost to a newly built naval power. The Russian people were also mad that the new ruler lost, and this caused humiliation across the world in the name of the Russian people. Again, Russia lost to Japan. Japan was just built up as a great naval power after Commander Perry came in there, and Russia was seen as being backwards. However, this little war in 1905 would not be as bad as Bloody Sunday of the same year. In 1905, after losing the devastating war in Korea, the Russian people demanded change from the Tsar. These people wanted more rights and privileges, a common cry in Romanov Russia. A high priest by the name of Joseph Gapan marched to the Tsar's palace in St. Petersburg, the Winter Hermitage, demanding that the Tsar fix the working class working conditions and provide them with more rights and privileges. Father Gapan wrote a letter to the Tsar the day before the day commonly referred to as in Russia as Bloody Sunday, stating that the people believe in thee. They have made up their minds to gather at the Winter Palace tomorrow 2 p.m. to lay their needs before thee. Do not fear anything. Stand tomorrow before the party and accept the humblest petition. I, the representative of the workingman, and my comrades, guarantee the inviolability of thy person. Or in other words, the priest was saying that the Russian subjects, the people, are demanding change, and they were willing to work with the Tsar on how to fix these differences and come to a common ground. However, Tsar Nicholas II did not see this strike as a good thing. He did not trust people, considering his family's history with the people. His grandfather died while on his daily trip to inspect the troops in 1881, and his father died in 1894 on vacation. So, in other words, Nicholas, like every other Romanov Tsar and Czarista, did not trust the people. So on Bloody Sunday 1905, Tsar Nicholas II ordered the people to turn around and go home and disperse, but the people kept up the peaceful protests. The Tsar called on his military to shoot at the protesters for protecting him, and thus Bloody Sunday had commenced. Nicholas allowed Bloody Sunday to happen because he felt that a government that is not a monarchy would be bad for us all. And he once stated this: I shall never under any circumstances agree to a representative form of government because I consider it harmful to the people whom God has entrusted to my care. Once again, the Russian people basically wanted to have a change in government, but the ruler wouldn't change because then they wouldn't be a Tsar, there would just be a monarch. This Bloody Sunday episode would lead into the revolutions of 1905 and 1917. The revolutions of 1905 was going to occur whether Nicholas II liked it or not. Historians have debated if it could have stopped, like Bloody Sunday. I, as a historian, also agreed that Bloody Sunday was a boiling point for the Russian people. Father Gapan, from his hiding place, later wrote a letter to Nicholas Romanov stating that the bloodshed that he created would lead to his blood being shed, and that the socialist groups would all unite and overthrow the Czarist system. So basically, Father Gapan forestarted the 1917 revolution with the socialists and communists coming into power. Nicholas II's Prime Minister, Vitin, encouraged the Tsar to come up with a solution to try to appease his subjects, especially after what Russia was facing the last years of turmoil. Tsar Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, the October 1905 decree, that established basic civil rights and a legislature, almost like a Congress, called the Duma. The Tsar ultimately signed the decree because his relative, the commander of the army, would shoot himself if the country became a military dictatorship, basically meaning that it would be worse than the 1905 revolution. Also, under the October Manifesto, universal marriage suffrage was established. So Russia finally allowed all men to vote, compared to the United States doing it nearly 130 years before Russia did it. The final years of Nicholas II's reign would be the worst for him. Following the creation of the Duma, Tsar Nicholas II never got along with the legislative branch, and he dissolved it at least 4 times in the first few years. In 1914, Russia entered World War I as an alliance of England and France. These alliances dated back to the prior decade to help counter German aggression. And remember that Russia was ruled under Tsar Nicholas II, and Germany was ruled under his cousin, Wilhelm II. So ultimately, there were literally families fighting against each other, and this would be called World War I or the Great War. Russia lost nearly 2 million people in the first 2 years of fighting and a huge amount of land. The Russian subjects were peeved and wanted to end the war before it got worse for them. The Tsar signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1917, and the Tsar cut off the fighting. Czarist Alexandria ruled over Russia on behalf of her husband, since he was the commander at the forefront of the war. And many people did not like that a woman was basically being a figurehead and ruling over them. Interestingly enough, the Czarista still saw what her husband was doing, literally fighting to reserve his family's dynastic rule, as a good thing. In August 1915, a few years before the treaty was signed, she wrote, "Our souls are fighting for the rights against the evil. You are proving yourself the autocrat without which Russia could not exist. God anointed you in the coronation, and God, who is always near you, will save your country and throne through your firmness." So he was basically saying that Tsar Nicholas II was doing the right thing in fighting this war, no matter how many people died. World War I partially led to the revolution in 1917. This revolution dealt with a change of power from the Romanovs to the Soviets under Lenin and Trotsky. The February Revolution of 1917 saw the Duma, the legislative branch of the Russian Constitution of 1905-1906, take control over a small portion of the government and form the provincial government, called the Kerensky government. The Tsar knew the situation was getting worse. He had to instill measures, or it would be too late. The last hour literally struck for the Russian Romanov Dynasty. In March 1917, a month after the February Revolution, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne for his brother, the Grand Duke Michael, and thus ended 300 years of the Romanov Dynastic Rule. Controversially, the Grand Duke did not want to rule because he did not have any more support than his brother did. Many saw the Grand Duke as a continuation of the Tsar, and the people did not want this. So the Grand Duke ended his claim to the throne, and the Romanovs were no more. So, following the abdication of the throne, Nicholas Romanov and the imperial family were placed under house arrest and sent to a remote part of the country under Vladimir Lenin, the new ruler of the communist Russia that was coming about. Lenin and his comrades saw themselves as the rulers that the Russian people wanted. They pulled the country out of World War I, promised food and more rights, and the return of the land that they lost. Lastly, Lenin ordered his men to shoot the imperial family in July 1918, and this caused a civil war to break out between the people who favored Lenin, called the Reds, and the people who wanted the Tsar back in power, called the Whites. The Whites didn't want the Tsar back in power, but they wanted a king and someone not like Lenin to rule them. Thus now you know why the Tsar and his family were shot at 2 a.m. in July 1918. They were shot because Lenin wanted to deal with the old system and instill a new one.